Well, thank you very much, Professor Ricardo Hausmann. Uh, Ricardo Hausmann is the head of the Grow Lab at Harvard, also a former chief economist at IBD, or BID, as we call in Brazil. Also, thank you, Silvio Dulinsky, who is executive committee member at the World Economic Forum, and also Lucas Amorim from Exame Business Magazine in Brazil, which is a leading business magazine in Brazil, to participate in the first international debate from Instituto Politica Viva. We are a not-for-profit and non-partisan institute in Brazil, focused on defending our democracy and institutions. I am Paulo Dalla Nora Macedo, its vice president, and I would also like to thank you for this opportunity, Rosângela Lira, our president, and Guilherme Setúbal, a fellow member of our executive committee. The idea of this gathering is to debate about the COVID impact, economic COVID impact, a social COVID impact, and a post-COVID economic development strategy, focused on Brazil and Latin America mostly. I will quick start with a question, and then Silvio and Lucas can jump in, and let's do one question per time so we are organized. Well, Professor Ricardo, as a head of the Grow Lab in Harvard, a very privileged observation point, how do you see Brazil right now?
Well, there are several dimensions to that question. Since the month of March, at the Growth Lab, we created a task force, and in that task force, we help countries think through what they're going to do on the COVID front. And so it's a group of 12 countries that we've been in conversations with. Brazil is not one of them. So I don't know as much about Brazil as I know about the other places, but in general, I can say the following things. In Latin America, at least, most countries acted fairly quickly to impose lockdowns. And that did not happen in Brazil. Those lockdowns were effective in preventing the first peak of cases and deaths that we saw in Italy, in Spain, in France, in New York, in Boston. So during the month of March and April, there was the perception that things were okay. In the case of Brazil, things got out of control in several parts of the country. And I think that even though the federal government hasn't been pushing for what I would say a coherent strategy vis-a-vis COVID-19, there was more action at the level of governors and mayors. So there's a mixed picture, a little bit like in the US. In Brazil and in the rest of Latin America, in spite of these lockdowns and social distancing measures, they were not able to prevent exponential growth in cases and deaths. And right now, most of Latin America, in spite of fairly severe lockdowns and in spite of very significant reductions in mobility and economic activity, cases and deaths are growing exponentially. This, I must say, is very different from what happens in Europe. In Europe, you have these spectacularly large increases in cases and deaths, but typically between the time they announced the lockdown until cases peaked, you had a period of like 20 days on average. And after that period of 20 days, what you saw is an exponential decline in the number of cases and deaths. So that in countries, for example, like France, cases are down like something like 97% from their peaks, 97%. In the cases like Ireland, they're down like 99% from their peaks. In Latin America and in Brazil, cases have continued to grow. So that's item number one. Item number two is that the social distancing measures in Latin America have been enormously costly from an economic point of view. So the lockdowns and the social distancing has not has been sort of like initially effective, but eventually not that effective, but economically very costly. And this is happening in the case of Brazil and many other Latin American countries in a context where the initial conditions were already weak. The sense that Brazil was already in a situation of relative fiscal weakness, during the about 4 years ago or so, the fiscal situation of Brazil was super weak. They turned the situation around, but sort of like precariously. And now you're seeing a very dramatic deterioration in economic conditions, which are going to translate into simultaneously a collapse in tax revenues and an increase in the need for social spending, whether it's on health or on income supports, as the economy goes through a very, very difficult period. So in general, I would say the second semester of 2020 looks very challenging.
Thank you. Silvio, Lucas, if you want to jump in.
Well, Professor Hausmann, I think in previous conversations, in the interactions we had in the activities of the World Economic Forum, you have always defended very much the importance of focusing on innovation in Latin America, that Latin America needs to leapfrog and the economic cycle and invest in adding value to our economies, our exports, our products and services, and not only rely only on the traditional exports of commodities. And how do you see this perspective with the economic challenges that you have just described to us? How do you see the perspective of the region now in continuing on this path of fostering innovation in the region?
Well, I think, yes, innovation.
To add on that question, you have a work at Chiapas in Mexico that says that social transfers doesn't increase the country, competitive over time, even in the region. It doesn't improve the people's life in the region. And we are going into this discussion now in Brazil to make part of the COVID transfer permanent, as you said, social transfer and so on. And I think that relates to Silvio's question. How do you balance that social transfer and also creating economic development through economic empowering the regions?
So very good. Those are fantastic questions. Let me start maybe by prefacing with what I think is a clear Brazilian problem. Brazil is a country that has probably one of the largest governments in terms of spending in the developing world, and has probably the highest tax rates in the developing world. The tax revenues as a share of GDP are over 40% and so on. Those are things that many OECD members don't reach, and countries at the level of income of Brazil typically don't reach. So our interpretation in a previous work I did about 12 years ago for the Centro de Liderança Pública, CLP, I did a growth diagnostic of Brazil. I thought that Brazil's problem was that it had an overextended state, that the Constitution of 1987, was it, or 88, increased dramatically current spending in government. And that left the government with very little money to do infrastructure spending. It left it with the need to raise tax revenues a lot. It left them with the need to borrow a lot, very fragile and sensitive to interest rates, causing the debt service to go up, the deficit to go up, requiring so this fragile debt dynamics. And so I thought at the time that Brazil would be better served if it could achieve a reduction in current spending especially, pensions and so on, aposentadorias, as we call them in Brazil, and use more of that money either for tax cuts or for infrastructure improvements. That would have created a more business-friendly environment, or more promotion of economic activity, and in particular, it would, what was very healthy about Brazil is the fact that, in spite of the fact that for a good chunk of the past few years, we've had the highest real interest rates in the world, investment rates, private investment rates in Brazil are kind of like normalish. So you can imagine in a world where, more normal interest rates, you would get much more private sector dynamism. Anyway, so that was my initial thoughts on more structural situations pre-COVID in Brazil. So I thought, it was very interesting in the government of President Temer, how quickly the situation was turned around the moment you indicated that there was, the possibility of fiscal stabilization and improvements. And suddenly you saw big declines in interest rates, a big recovery in economic activity that came out of nowhere. So I think that working on that agenda is important. But you mentioned several things. One is, Silvio mentioned innovation, and you mentioned Chiapas. What was interesting in Chiapas is that this was a situation where the government, saw the Zapatista rebellion in 1994 and got really scared and decided to put a lot of money into Chiapas. And they improved the infrastructure, they improved the social infrastructure, they improved the external connectivity of Chiapas. They spent a lot of money in Chiapas. And Chiapas went from being the poorest state in Mexico to being the poorest state in Mexico. And it went from having the lowest growth rate in Mexico to having the lowest growth rate in Mexico. So all of these well-intentioned activities to try to improve on things in Chiapas did not materialize into more development. In our diagnostic there, we thought that the problem was that there was not enough innovation, that the country could not become richer by doing more of the same. Given whatever they were able to do at the time, they could not grow into something more advanced, and that what needed was initiatives that would transform the productive structure of the country. I think that this may be true for parts of Brazil, but it's not true for all of Brazil. I think in part, the problem in Brazil is that you have both Embraer and Vale, right? So Vale is a very good multinational corporation, very good at mining and so on, but it's important in several states in Brazil. So like the manufacturing base of Brazil has never been able to have an environment in which it can grow, exploiting global opportunities. I remember the days in which Brazil, say in 1980, looked more promising as a manufacturing base than Korea. And now look at Samsung and tell me what is the equivalent Samsung in Brazil. So that productive transformation never happened in Brazil. And I think in part it's because the macroeconomics was never the right thing, but because Brazil has been very disciplined. I would say it's probably the most serious of the Latin American countries in terms of betting on technology and so on. And that's why Embraer exists to begin with, right? And so in my mind, there is, you need more of this transformation, but there's very little space for that transformation, given the other problems, fiscal problems that I mentioned before, that the society, maybe the society is too unequal. It has very, very large demands for redistribution, and that leaves relatively little space for other things. Although the things that are expensive on the budget are not Fame Zero, are not the social transfers, right? It's more the aposentadorias and a very large public debt that is very expensive. And that leaves very little space for other things.
Professor, here in Brazil, we love to compare Ayrton Senna, the pilot, with.
I just saw the movie lately. During this COVID, I saw the movie. What a sad story. Yeah.
We love to compare him with economic issues. And people say that in rainy days, Senna could go from 10th to 1st in a few minutes. And now people, we are trying to understand which country could be the Ayrton Senna in this specific situation. Is there any country, well, the countries that are doing poorly jobs, we know, and we know what can be the Ayrton Senna in this crisis, and what lessons can this country bring to Brazil and to Latin America?
Well, let me say something that I think is somewhat surprising to me. One of the things that has happened in Latin America is that we've imposed these very, very costly lockdowns that ended up being relatively ineffective in epidemiological terms. That is, they did not prevent the exponential growth. For example, among the 12 countries that I'm working on Jordan, working on Namibia, and these countries have COVID under control. And you know, better than more advanced countries and so on. And part of the reason is because they're very attentive to learn from their own experience. It's very dangerous to think that, say, if you're going to deal with COVID, that what you need to do is to follow best practice. By the way, best practice is one of the most dangerous words in development, because it assumes that people know how to manage a crisis like this. And we should start the management of this crisis sort of like by knowing that we don't know. It's not that we know, or that, you know, somebody, I don't know, McKinsey knows, or the WHO knows what to do, and we just need to listen to them. This is a new disease. This is a new virus. Nobody knows. And countries are going to differ in terms of how quickly they can learn from other people's experience and from their own experience, because each country is different. For example, in the US, over 40% of the deaths happened in nursing homes. In Latin America, typically, we don't have nursing homes. So, and a lockdown is not going to solve that problem. That's a different problem that needs a different solution. In Latin America, we can order lockdowns of firms, but we have difficulty in shutting down the informal sector. And if people don't go out to earn their living, you know, they'll die from starvation before they die from COVID. So we have not figured out how to make the fight against COVID intelligent and smart and as efficient as possible, given the trade-offs that we face. So I think that this experience is going to show which countries are able to learn from their own experience to find things that are smart and intelligent to do. And they'll probably then be able to have less damage coming from COVID and more trust that they can figure things out. For example, right now, it would be fantastic if information on COVID was available to researchers, so that researchers could identify and detect, you know, how are people getting infected? Where are they getting infected? Are the infections happening within families? Are they particularly prone in the informal sector? And are particularly, for example, there's this hypothesis, which we have not tested, that it has to do with the fact that, for example, there's this paper in Peru that says that 30% of the households in Peru don't have refrigerators. And consequently, they have to go out very frequently to buy food because they cannot store fresh food at home. And maybe that's how they're getting infected. Okay, so that means that maybe the strategy to address those infections is different, right? But that implies that we assume that we have the capacity to figure things out, that we are going to use science and technology and thought and information to do these things. And if we do, those skills that we develop in managing COVID, we will be able to redeploy in managing and solving other problems. But it is this capacity, we should stop thinking of the problem as being sort of like the knowledge economy, that there's knowledge out there and we need to get it. It's more of the learning economy. It's things that we need to figure out, things that we need to find out, and that we have to develop the capacity to learn. And I think that is, I mean, if you look at a country like Israel, which by the way is, 72 years old, they are thinking of COVID as a problem that they have actually partially mismanaged, but that will require solutions that may become their next area of comparative advantage, because they'll come up with new therapeutics, maybe new testing technologies and so on and so forth that the world will need. They're developing because they need them, but if they develop them, they may become their next product for the future. And that in general is something that I find is a very general activity for, or a general approach to development strategies. Work on the things that are your biggest headache. And if you find solutions to things that are your biggest headaches, your headache will come down. But because you're not the only country in the world that has those headaches, your solutions may become your next area of comparative advantage. It may become your next suite of products for the future.
It's not that simple, right?
No, well, it is, countries are rich not because of what they have, but of what they can get to know how to do. And so it's really this accumulation of these capabilities that pushes you forward.
Well, Professor, building on that question that Silvio and I had before, that, I mean, it's very clear that social transfers alone won't do the trick of, improving complexity. Yeah. You need innovation, you need, as you said, you need improve economic complexity. You have the atlas of economic complexity. And if you put COVID in that picture, and there is a thought in the economic developed world that the easiest way to develop a country is to plug your country in the global supply chain, to be part of the global supply chain. With COVID, there is this discussion that maybe the global supply chain won't be available or that much stretched anymore because of future pandemics and so on. So countries like Brazil, which are not plugged in the global chain fully, like Korea and so on, should they think about another strategy to develop, or is this global supply chain strategy will be available in the future, or that strategy has to be thought again?
So that's a very good question. The pre-COVID world was a world that saw an enormous collapse in transportation costs, which allowed for the creation of these value chains that were delocalized. So we went away from the idea that you had to have all of your supply chain around you. Say a city like Detroit, where you had, the car manufacturers and the first-tier suppliers and the second-tier suppliers and the third-tier suppliers and everybody in Detroit around each other, right? This cluster idea, to the idea that these things could be delocalized and connected through cheap transportation. That's a dynamic that Brazil participated very little in, probably because of its own policies. What I think will come next, and Richard Baldwin has written very interestingly about it, is and post-COVID is the idea that we're doing this Zoom talk, right? I've been holed up in Western Massachusetts for the last 4 months. Harvard is closed. I've never worked so hard. So now we realize that we can do things from home. But the things that can be done from home can also be done from abroad. So I don't know if Silvio is in Geneva and you're in Brazil and I'm in. So here you have like a global value chain in this conference, right? But that means that everything that can be done from home can be done from abroad, which means that there may be a new value chains where tasks are delocalized. And that includes many activities that, for lack of a better term, you might want to call services. But it's really like trade and tasks. So you will find some businesses can have more of their activities done at home and consequently done also from abroad. And those activities might decide to delocalize. And you know, maybe have activities in Sao Paulo or in Belo Horizonte or in Fortaleza or whatever. So there will be new ways of participating in the global value chain, not only through the export and import of parts, process and re-export, but through this trade and tasks through Zoom or other technologies. And I think that multinational corporations are bound to restructure to exploit these opportunities, and that countries are going to find that they may be able to participate in value chains through more, you know, trade and tasks or delocalization of these tasks than through the traditional, say, value chains in manufacturing. It may be that, you know, people, you know, are going, you know, there's a lot of talk these days about moving from just in time to just in case. That, you know, to look at the risks associated with value chains that are too reliant on a single supplier, value chains that are too vertical, too unilinear and have more of a networky structure. So, you know, that may mean that like the value chains of the future will have a different architecture from the value chains of the past. And that, you know, while you might have, you know, tariffs and other obstacles and VAT or whatever, creating barriers to international trade, it's harder for countries to prevent the free trade of services through Zoom. And that may open new avenues. It may open new avenues.
Professor, I have a question about the impact that you're mentioning on the future of corporations. It's like because corporations are going, there's another discussion going on, which is about the stakeholder capitalism. And the expectation of society towards the companies are changing. And with the current crisis, we have heard a lot about this, about companies have to care more about all their stakeholders, the employees, the customers, their supply chain. How do you see this discussion evolving? And it's very different also depending on the countries, the level of maturity of the economies, and some countries can have other pressing needs in the short term. But overall, how do you see this evolution from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism in this moment?
No, I think this is obviously a very significant trend, and I think it's a very positive trend. You know, in essence, a corporation lives on the basis of the loyalty of its different stakeholders. You know, your suppliers have to cope with what, you know, life is very incomplete. It's impossible to write complete contracts that take care of every eventuality. So when things happen that were not expected, you know, you rely on trust, on solidarity, on you know, on the on the goodwill of other people to see you through. And that might be your suppliers, that might be your workers, that might be your neighbors, that might be your consumers, your clients, and that might be your financiers. So everybody in your ecosystem has sort of like hopefully to see some relationship of loyalty and trust that allows you to manage situations as they come. Now, if you are you're not going to get to that level of loyalty and trust if you say, I only do things for my shareholders. So when things turn out and I now have to be good to you, I won't, because it's not good for my shareholders. You won't be able to sustain the kind of solidarity and trust that's necessary to manage a corporation that relies on so much goodwill from so many people if the corporation is only loyal to its shareholders. And one of the legal arguments is that corporations live on the idea of there being legal persons. You know, legally we created the fiction that a corporation is like a person, and we have used all the apparatus of the law to say, well, this, you know, people have rights, people have obligations, people can write contracts. So let's move all of that to corporations as if they were a person. So they have rights, they have this, they have, and then the question is, okay, if we're going to recognize you as a corporation, for example, if we're going to recognize you as having limited liability, right? So that if you go under, you know, it's this entity that went under, not the individuals that are involved in the corporation. Okay, what other responsibilities are you supposed to have? And I think that the movement towards saying, no, you should have in your statutes, you know, some sense of responsibility to the different stakeholders, to your suppliers, to your customers, to your neighbors, to your workers, to the government, to the fisc, and to financial markets. That ecosystem on which you live, that should be reflected in the statutes of corporations, and it should affect how they make decisions.
Professor, I would like to talk about this subject in a very specific market, the vaccines market. Companies like Pfizer and Moderna are in advanced projects of launching their vaccines. We read a lot of specific countries like the US trying to buy big amounts of vaccines for the first months or the first years. What's the role of these companies and the government looking at the ESG prospect? They had to build money for their shareholders, but also for the society and for the governments. Are you optimistic about this natural conflict in the vaccine development or not?
Well, it's a great example that you're asking about. It's a great example. There was a meeting of the World Health Organization, their last annual meeting, and part of what was on the agenda was coordination so that the moment the vaccine is available, we will have the manufacturing capacity to manufacture as fast as possible to supply the whole world. Because this obviously is a global problem. If you vaccinate half of the world, the virus is going to survive in the other half of the world. And the moment the world tries to reopen, the virus is going to go back global. So we need to vaccinate the world, and we have a vested interest in making sure that that happens. There are plenty ways of doing it. For example, Pfizer, Moderna, and so on. If they come up with a vaccine, that's fine, but who's going to manufacture that vaccine? Who's going to have the capacity to vaccinate and the logistics? This vaccine is likely to require refrigeration, etc. So where are these value chains that can do that? Well, we don't need to wait for the vaccine to set up those value chains. And the fact that the vaccine was developed by Pfizer or by Moderna, it doesn't mean that it has to be manufactured by Pfizer or by Moderna. So right now, the countries should be writing these contracts to have you know, to get access to the technology, get access to the way of making the vaccine with the help of Pfizer or Moderna or whoever, so that the world can get to maximum production as quickly as possible. That was an effort that was supposed to be coordinated by the World Health Organization, but instead the topic of that meeting was the US dissatisfaction with the way the WHO was talking about China, and consequently the US then decided to leave the WHO, and the issue of, you know, US-China conflict you know, got in the way. But I think that all countries should be monitoring all the vaccines that are out there, and there are plenty of them. I think that there are over 25 vaccines that are being tested on humans right now, and to make sure that we have a strategy when there is a vaccine that we feel comfortable that is safe and effective, that the production and distribution of that vaccine can happen as quickly as possible. This idea of America first, so America first at vaccinating, is not something that the world should put itself behind. I think the world has to organize the production of whatever vaccine comes out of the technological process. And in this business of you know, the intellectual property of Pfizer or Moderna or whatever other company, that's a question of money. It should not be a question of who has or doesn't have the vaccine. Those are two separate questions. You know, having a purchase guarantee by governments is a way of lowering risks, facilitating capital to flow into these manufacturing facilities and into these logistics facilities. And it allows the market to work more effectively. And that means that you would need some public-private cooperation to make sure that the market responds to the needs of the people.
Well, Professor, coming back to Brazil, you have gave us a very good insight about focus on this innovation and this global supply chain in a different way. I mean, not in a physical, but in a service-oriented way. And the discussion that we are having in Brazil right now seems that the government, especially the financial minister, Paulo Guedes, is betting a lot in the wholesale reform strategy. I will do a lot of reforms, tax reform, pension funds, administrative, and so on, and that will liberate Brazil potential with a different perspective that you have, that you brought. And I know that you have a stat that shows in the Grow Lab that only less than 20%, I believe, to 19% of something like that, of the countries that undergo big wholesale reforms, they are able to achieve a sustainable growth path. So I think that, I mean, could you give us some consideration about this? Are we focused on the wrong side of the picture, wholesale reforms, etc., and wasting energy, effort, Congress negotiation, and that doesn't lead us anywhere? So
I would say, in the case of, I mean, I like many of the reforms that are in the Guedes agenda. I think aposentadorias is a problem. The pensions are a problem. I think you've had forever, you have this tax that is not a value-added tax. It goes with this long name of movimiento. What's it called? Yeah?
ICMS.
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 Imposto de circulação de mercadorias e serviços.
Okay, so you see already the problem is already in the name. But so you have some of these things are obstacles that are the consequence of the fact that you have this state that is overextended, it cannot fund itself, doesn't leave any space for infrastructure, requires very high taxes a state that borrows too much of the national savings and leaves too little of those savings in the market. So I think you need those reforms. In your particular case, if you do the same reform in another place, you may not see those effects. But in your case, I think that some of those reforms are critical. But you know, Brazil is a very big country. It's a very big country. It's a very diverse country. So the things that will progress, you know, will allow, you know, Bahia or Piauí to advance and progress may be different from Curitiba or Sao Paulo or elsewhere. So Brazil has shown that it is globally competitive in agriculture and mining. Amazingly so. In agriculture in particular, technology has been critical to your success. So it's not natural resources, it's really technology. And there are many mining companies that in the world that don't, for example, Chile has a lot of mines. There are no Chilean multinationals in mining. But there are many multinationals in Chile. So the Chile, in spite of having two centuries of mining, hasn't learned how to mine well enough so that they can mine elsewhere. So I think that focusing on the technological capacity of the things you do, I mean, in Sao Paulo, it could be a powerhouse in manufacturing. I think it hasn't been to the extent that in part because of macro reasons. So I would say, you know, focus on, do all those things, but don't abandon the capacity to acquire, develop, adapt new know-how, new technologies, because those are the core of the story. I mean, the reason why you can produce soybeans in Brazil is not because of some act of God. It's because the soybeans are genetically modified to adapt themselves to Brazil. It's because no-till agriculture has allowed to change, you know, the impact of agricultural production on the fertility of the land. It's because you've been able to put together sophisticated value chains that support agriculture. And those lessons from your own success in agriculture should be inspiration for your potential success in many, many other areas. So yes, you need some of these macro reforms to set the stage, particularly in Brazil, but you should not abandon the complexity agenda. That is the thing that is going to exploit those opportunities that are going to be created by reform. I wanted to say one more thing. I don't want to sound as if I am, I'm saying, don't worry about inequality. I want to say that and consequently, don't transfer money to the poor. I want to say, look, worry about inequality, because inequality, and especially in Brazil, the fundamental source of inequality is inequality in productivity. It's inequality in productivity, that people in different parts of the country, even in different parts of the city, are unequally productive. And some activities are very productive, and many activities are very unproductive. And unproductive activities are a waste of people's effort. So a strategy that includes people in the more productive part of the economy increases their productivity, and consequently that's good for growth, and increases their income, and that's consequently good for inequality, or reducing inequality. So I think you need an inclusion agenda. You need to include people so that they're able to participate in the more advanced, more formal, more modern economy. That a lot of the poverty you see in Brazil is people who are disconnected from the modern economy. They are in some sense excluded from the modern economy. And sometimes that exclusion is because, you know, they didn't have access to education, or sometimes it's they don't have access to the means of transportation to get to where the formal jobs are. Sao Paulo is the only city I know in the world where the rich move around in helicopters, and where there are heliports on the ceilings of many, many buildings, and people go from parts in helicopter. This is the ultimate of an exclusive regime, in the sense that the transportation infrastructure in cities is so bad that people may not be able to get to the places of work unless they spend 2 hours going to work and 2 hours coming back. And that makes it impossible for people to access those jobs. So a lot of the city infrastructure, urban infrastructure, urban transport, connections, access to internet, access to electricity, to water, to the basic services and so on, access to the labor market, to the opportunities of work, traps people in low productivity activities that makes the society unequal and wasteful, because you're wasting their willingness to work. So I think that part of the trade-offs that societies face is whether they want to spend money including people into progress. Okay? And I think that an inclusion agenda, which would, for example, make it easier for people to get to work, make it easier for people to access the labor market, access finance, access the internet, access electricity, and so on. An inclusion agenda is better than a redistribution agenda. A redistribution agenda is saying, look, since you are not included, here is compensation. Okay, so I'm compensating you for your exclusion. I'm sure that people who are excluded would feel much better if they were included rather than if they were compensated for their exclusion. So I think that if you have a trade-off between an agenda of inclusion and an agenda of redistribution, I think go for inclusion. Inclusion is win-win. It will make you richer and it will make you more equal.
Professor, I'd like to also ask your thoughts about the difficulty in our current societies about establishing dialogue between people with different opinions. I have the impression that this is becoming, we live in societies that are more and more polarized. Everything is more black and white, 1 is 0, and it's difficult to establish dialogues. And having the privilege of living in Europe, I see some countries that have overcome that and have been able to find common ways of, even if they have different opinions, they find ways of converging and going in one single direction. What are your thoughts about this and what this represents in our current democracy and society?
I think this is a great question. I think that in order for open debate and dialogue and so on to work, there has to be a shared structure. That is, the idea we have, and the idea that's, for example, Karl Popper had on the advantages of an open society, is that in an open society, people with different ideas would put different views on the table, and these ideas and views would compete with each other, and out of that, there would be evolution and progress of ideas. But that assumes that these ideas are competing. In some field, like, suppose you have a football match, right? So it's Santos versus Botafogo, but there's one field. They are on the same floor. So there's a shared field in which these ideas are competing. But if you have a situation where these groups stop talking to each other and they start believing in conspiracy theories and crazy ideas about what the others are about, then you destroy the underlying assumption that there is competition between ideas, that there is something that you might want to call like objective reality, that none of us has a clear idea of what that objective reality is, but that we are competing for interpretations of what objective reality is. And there is a shared football field. There's a shared space in which this debate is happening. And I think that the lack of this shared space, I think in some sense, Twitter is the ultimate ability to create these separate communities that don't necessarily talk to each other and are willing to believe anything about each other. You know, it's amazing the amount of crazy, stupid conspiracy theories that are out there, which are very detrimental to the ability of society to come together for the following reason. I personally think that, you know, while many people think that the world is a fight between good and evil, I think that there are very few humans who think of themselves as evil. They have a narrative in their head which justifies what they do as being the good. So we need to have a discussion about those narratives that justify good and evil in each head. And I think that part of what's happening, and I think that in fact, this is not just you know, an involuntary thing that happened by coincidence. It is that to a large extent, but it's also something that, you know, if you're, I don't know, the Russian Secret Service and you're trying to intervene in the politics of another place, you work on fragmenting society by making one part of society believe crazy things about other parts of society, in order to break the capacity to cooperate, to at least compete in the field of ideas and destroy the football field in which these things are supposed to be competing.
Professor, this kind of division, in talking about Brazil specifically, is Brazil losing its soft power, and how important is it for a country in the next decade to have a soft power to attract investments and to grow?
Well, you know, I come from Venezuela. And I say this because Venezuela has never made it to the World Cup. You know, we play mostly baseball, not football. We have a few good football players, not too many, but we've never made it into a World Cup. And as a consequence, when there is a World Cup, Venezuelans root for Brazil. Why? Because Brazil has sort of like, you know, it's a likable country. You know, you have good music, you have your smile, you know, your simpaticos, right? So in principle, you have what it takes to have soft power. You have what it takes to have soft power, but you need, in some sense, to have enough of a internal cohesion that allows you to project those warm feelings internationally. Brazil has been quite, to some extent, isolationist, right? You are in Latin America, but not fully Latin American because there's a language difference, but I'm sure that if Brazil gets to a situation where domestic polarization comes down and there's more of a capacity to develop a shared sense of us, a shared sense of being Brazilian, you have the raw materials to have a lot of soft power abroad. You know, there's very little animosity against Brazil. There's a lot of warm things that people, some samba, bossa nova, etc. There's a lot of cultural values that, and you know, you play football so great, and so there are many things that people like about Brazil that can be the basis of projecting a goodwill and getting back, you know, people's goodwill and willingness to cooperate with you. So I would say you have what it takes to accumulate soft power.
Well, Professor, I mean, as a final thought, since we are approaching the end, you have been saying, like, for the last 4 months or 5 months, that the economy is only be back on track once the health crisis is contained. You have stressed that a lot. And there is a paper from Chad Severson from the Chicago University that, in fact, proves that. He put together 2.2 million data points for individual business from 110 countries, and he has shown that only 7 percentage points of the drop in demand was related to the government actions, lockdowns. More than 60% points in the drop in demand, or like 8 times more, is related to people's fears about going out. So, I mean, you were right before, and that means that we are 2-3 years from the normal business as usual, and so we can update the phrase of it's the health stupid instead of it's the economy stupid. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that given how contagious this disease is, we are not going to have a normal situation until 80% of the people, 85% of people have immunity. And there are only 2 ways of getting immunity that we know. One is getting sick and recovering, and the other one is getting vaccinated. And what we're really in a game is in containing the situation long enough so that we can all get vaccinated and we don't have to all get sick. But I see it, you know, Harvard closed before the government of Massachusetts closed. We didn't wait for government orders to decide to close. And so do many businesses. And Apple stores decide when to open, and they're more conservative than whatever governments of the places where they're in, because they, as Silvio was mentioning before, ESG, they see stakeholders, they see a responsibility towards society at large. So yes, until 80+% of the people are immune, we're going to be battling this disease, and we will not be in normal situations. Normal situations meaning, you know, I teach in class, I hug my students, we go out for a bar for drinks, I go to somebody's wedding and we dance in the floor. All of these pre-COVID world, that world is not coming back until the vaccine. And until that time, I think economic activity will be depressed. We have to find ways of having it minimally depressed, but it will be depressed. And it's very clear that the countries that did not contain the disease are now having more significant constraints on their economic activity than the countries that were more successful, even if they had horrible death peaks, like say France or Italy or Ireland. They now are more open than the US, even though they were tougher at the beginning. So yes, I think that it's the health stupid. And let's get this over, and let's get this over as a society together with enough cooperation so everybody can make it through, and to preserve as much the livelihood of people and the health of businesses, so that we have an economy that can recover quickly.
So thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Silvio, and thank you, Lucas. I mean, the first time that you are back in Brazil, I mean, it'll be a pleasure to host a dinner for you here in our house and to explore more that conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.